And Anil, you can go.
Yeah. So very good afternoon. On behalf of United Nations Environment Program, UNOCHA, and National Institute of Disaster Management of India, I take the honor of welcoming you all in this global series of webinars on a very pertinent topic, that is environment and emergencies. As past 4 months, we have been witnessing a new kind of emergency, which is a very different complex emergency, as it has given rise to disasters within disasters. We had witnessed complex emergencies, we had witnessed chemical accidents, we have witnessed health challenges, and beside this, a series of natural disasters also have been witnessed in various geographical parts of the world. Beside this, it has also been realized the issues of environmental challenges and issues of environmental impacts of disasters, and on the other hand, environmental aspects aggravating the impact of emergencies and adding to the complexity of the situations have also emerged as very important dimension. Looking to this theme, UNEP and UNOCHA have taken this lead of this webinar of six sessions, which will also lead to a kind of a supporting the capacity building at the global level in understanding better the interlinkages between environment and emergencies. The objective of this initiative is basically to help the professionals, help the researchers, and also the people in practice on the ground to understand the linkages and also integrate into the planning process so that we can deal with the emergencies in better way. So again, I welcome to all the delegates, all the experts on this panel who have joined me in this opening webinar, because today's webinar is the inaugural webinar of the series of 6 webinars, and we have a large number of participants joining here from across the world. So this is really a matter of pleasure for all of us that the issue of environment and emergency linkages is being considered as important. And this webinar is also going to introduce about the basic issues of the linkages between environment and emergencies, putting forth some of the examples from the recent incidences and also from the historical perspectives, but also setting the trend for the next 5 webinars where we will be discussing about the special thematic issues. So I will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation to give a brief about the series of this webinar. Just a moment. I am taking time to share. No, how I'm facing problem sharing my presentation now. Earlier I shared.
Probably read out, Anil.
Yeah. So the 6 webinars which are slated in this program are today's is the first one, and second one which we will be organizing on 19th August. That will be on the localizing issue and also looking at the lockdown challenges that has emerged globally with this pandemic situation. And then on 23rd of September, the focus would be on crisis waste management, because waste management has emerged as a major challenge during this disaster, which has been realized that the normal strategies are the mechanisms of waste management do not work, especially when we are dealing with health emergencies, because the waste also contain a lot of hazardous components, infectious waste, and we need to have a very specific strategy drawn much in advance in place. So these are the kind of issues which we are going to discuss. Then on 14th of October, we are also going to discuss about the experience that we had during this pandemic related lockdown period, that was of closing down the industry and then reopening the industries. And then when reopening of the industry took place, then there were also the incidences of chemical accidents taking place, which were also resulted in lethal and some lethal, sublethal kind of implications. So that is also an important dimension. So on 14th of October, we are going to discuss. Then on 25th of November, we are going to discuss that how sustainability is a very important dimension in the humanitarian response, relief, and also in the post relief stages, so that the future risk dimensions of the emergency response can be taken care of. Then 16th December, we will be having the concluding webinar, where we will be discussing about that how we integrate the lessons towards reducing future risks of emergencies, and how we will have to draw the co-benefits of emergency management as well as the sustainability issues. So these are the kind of 6 webinars that we are going to discuss here, and we are going to have in this series. Then today we have 4 expert speakers with us. Sebastian, who is the Chief of Emergency Response Section of UN-OCHA, and Muralee Thummarukudy, who is the Operations Manager. They would be delivering the opening remarks, and we'll have 2 luminary speakers on today's webinar. Margareta, who is the focal point for response from UNEP-OCHA Joint Environment Unit, and Lisa, who would be focusing on linkage of environment emergencies and the current pandemic context. I would also like to inform to all the participants that we also have a facility to have questions. So we have a question box. So I would request that the participants who would like to ask questions, kindly write down your questions, and you can also indicate about, in case your question is directed to a specific panelist, you can also introduce yourself briefly. And I am also to inform you that this webinar is being recorded, so that we can also draw the lessons of useful discussions in this program. So to begin with, I take the opportunity on behalf of the organizers to invite for delivering the opening remarks to the Chief of UN-OCHA Emergency Response Section, Sebastian Rhodes-Stampa. Sebastian, please.
Thank you very much, Anil. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Super. Thank you very much again. This is a wonderful opportunity, and one which I'm delighted to take up. I see that we have 985 attendees, and that's rapidly climbing. And I'd like to welcome you all in the audience on behalf of OCHA and UNEP to this new global webinar series on the theme of environmental emergencies in the face of COVID-19. There's clearly tremendous interest in this event, and there's a strong sign that there's an ever-growing demand to learn more about this topic, particularly from humanitarians. I think I would acknowledge at the outset that humanitarians are not always doing that well when it comes to the environment. It's quite often for us an afterthought, something that's neglected during the first phases of the emergency, when the focus is quite rightly on saving lives and alleviating suffering. But we often forget that failing to mainstream environmental considerations at the earliest stages of humanitarian response can lead to escalating and cascading shocks and impacts, which might, in fact, eventually undermine the purpose of humanitarian action itself. And this is not the way we want to go. We need to acknowledge these shortfalls and act upon them. Environmental issues have been a prominent feature of almost every emergency, in fact, not almost every emergency that I've been called upon to respond, be it a disaster or a complex emergency. Last year, I was fortunate enough to support the government of Mozambique as the Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator, responding to Tropical Cyclone Idai. And I witnessed once again the enormous level of destruction that we can be confronted with by weather-related phenomena. Entire villages were submerged under flood water as the floods rose, and thousands of people were left stranded on roofs, trees. Crops were wiped out, livestock was lost, families were separated as they fled the rising floodwaters, and others were trapped on high ground, unable to access basic goods and services for days, and in some cases weeks. And we had to service their needs initially with helicopters while we waited for the floods to subside. Tens of thousands of people were displaced, many having to flee with nothing as the waters rose rapidly. And of course, there was the threat of disease outbreak. We had a cholera outbreak. It was a really desperate situation. The cyclone and subsequent flooding resulted in the deaths of a very conservative estimate would be about 600 people. I imagine as time has been taken to reconsider that figure, it would be much higher. About 1,600 people were seriously injured, and 1.8 million people affected in Mozambique alone. The damage caused by the disaster was estimated, I think at the time, to be about 1.4 billion for Mozambique, but Mozambique wasn't the only country hit. Malawi, Madagascar, and Zimbabwe suffered from the devastating impact of what turned out to be the deadliest and strongest tropical cyclone in the Southwest Indian Ocean. Cyclone Idai's devastation was amplified by deforestation in the region. And for those of you who've been to Mozambique, this is something you can see if you drive down any roads in the centre of the country. Since 1980, and I find this quite staggering, Mozambique has lost some 370,000 square kilometres of its forests. And just to give you an idea, that's an area slightly larger than modern day Germany. It's just enormous. Much of the loss has been attributed to slash and burn agricultural practices, but charcoal and timber production have also played a part. I was very lucky in Mozambique to have the support of the JEU, who deployed experts to support the response operation in a very timely manner, because shortly after Idai struck Mozambique, Cyclone Kenneth made landfall and is today the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded to make landfall in the African continent. What I saw in Mozambique is no different to what I've seen in so many other countries worldwide throughout my career. What lessons did we learn? What can we take away from Mozambique? Well, I think what happened there, two off-season storms that really the strongest that have ever been seen on the continent, coming out of nowhere. This should serve as a real wake-up call for all of us who take the threat of climate change seriously. And if you don't, you really need to. According to the World Meteorological Organization, the frequency of the most intense tropical cyclones, like those classified as category 4 or 5 and associated with more rainfall, will increase with a warming climate. And even the best prepared countries will face unprecedented challenges to their capacities in dealing with more extreme weather events. It also shows the importance of bringing together humanitarian, climate and environmental expertise in times of crisis. And it's from this viewpoint that we're privileged to have a long-standing partnership with the United Nations Environment Programme through the UNEP-OCHA Joint Environment Unit, dating back, gosh, to 1994. The unit's a unique example in bringing together the best of both UN agencies. It represents the technical expertise of UNEP and the humanitarian mandate of OCHA. It is an extremely useful tool. And now, outside of disasters, we find ourselves confronted by the COVID pandemic, which has only been the latest very powerful wake-up call about the links between environment and emergencies. Close to 16.5 million confirmed cases and 650,000 deaths globally. And I wrote that yesterday and had to update it this morning. The figures are moving so fast as a result of the transmission of a zoonotic disease. We are all affected by COVID and the pandemic, and we are all accountable for making sure that we do whatever we can to address it. The pandemic has a foothold in 216 countries or territories, and some of these are countries that are already in crisis due to conflicts, disasters, and climate change, and they are home to a large number of vulnerable people in need of emergency assistance. OCHA at this time is determined that its crucial life-saving, life-sustaining work is sustained. More than 100 million people already rely on support from the United Nations humanitarian agencies. OCHA's top priority at this time is to ensure that we do the level best that we can to keep providing life-saving, life-sustaining aid for these people while supporting a wider systems response to COVID-19. Individuals and population groups who've already been suffering from violence, from stigma, from discrimination, from unequal access to basic services and living conditions are bearing the brunt of this new crisis. COVID-19 is deepening the hunger crisis in the world's hunger hotspots and creating new epicenters of hunger across the globe. We've all heard very dire warnings about this, and I can tell you they're the tip of the iceberg. The number of acutely food insecure people in countries affected by conflict, disasters, or economic crises is predicted to increase from 149 million pre-COVID to 270 million before the end of the year if our assistance is not provided urgently. And of course, one of the most wicked consequences of the pandemic is the rise of gender-based violence. Under the umbrella of the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, the IAC members and partners, including FAO, IOM, UNDP, UNFPA, Habitat, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNRWA, WFP, WHO, our NGO colleagues, both international and national, and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, have stepped up their response to address the most urgent humanitarian health, protection, and socio-economic needs caused by the pandemic. The GHRP is targeting nearly 250 million with COVID-19 assistance. Initially in May, we asked for 6.7 billion to implement a response. Having reconsidered and begun to understand the second and third order effect the COVID pandemic would have, that funding requirement has now risen to over 10 billion. However, what the pandemic has shown us is what we can do when we come together and work together. Innovations and adaptations have been made to help comply with physical distancing requirements and to address mobility constraints when conducting distributions, when providing healthcare, nutrition, sexual and reproductive health, mental health and psychosocial support, and gender-based violence services. We're using digital technology and alternative means of communicating the direct and indirect risks of COVID-19. Increased efforts being made to engage with diverse communities and those who we wouldn't normally engage with, and local actors as well, to reach those most isolated with assistance. The lesson learned from all of this is that it is better, cheaper, and more dignified to frontload response to crises and their secondary impacts. Waiting until the full impacts are visible is a more expensive proposition, and delaying any action only shifts the burden of payment to the future, but the humanitarian, environmental, and economic price of the response will also exponentially increase. Just a word quickly on climate crisis before I conclude. I think the COVID-19 pandemic gives us a very small hint of what we're faced with under the climate crisis. While recognizing that the root causes of many of the most urgent humanitarian situations today are political, the climate emergency is a primary intensifier of humanitarian crises. Humanitarian action itself cannot end humanitarian need, but humanitarian action should and must seek where possible to be part of the solution to the global challenges that we face, such as climate change. We need to make sure that humanitarian action is forward-looking, and we need to engage better in anticipatory action. Failure to do so comes at a cost. The cost of inaction can and will be massive in humanitarianism if we do not act now, if we do not act and do so now. So to conclude, and I certainly wouldn't want to take much more time with some very, very good speakers to follow, I think that there's growing and broader recognition that we need environmental expertise, we need rapid environmental assessments, we need to enhance sustainability of humanitarian action. We need to do this now, and we need this fully embedded in a humanitarian response. A change of mindset, however, is needed to make sure that this becomes standard practice. We need to make better use of environmental expertise already available for deployment through standby partnerships, which are enormously useful to us. We need some small adjustments to humanitarian action to ensure that we have a long-term positive impact for affected populations and countries to whom, of course, we're accountable. And we need champions of change, and those are necessary at all levels to prevent environmental concerns from being sidelined in priority setting and funding. And that's not always easy. We deal on a daily basis with the most appalling crises, and it's easy to forget what should actually be a mainstream part of our response. It's only by making sure that we understand what the climate crisis really means and other global environmental challenges in our time that we can ensure humanitarian action remains fit for purpose in a world which is rapidly evolving. If we don't change with it, then I'm afraid we will become less and less relevant. I'm delighted to see, almost certainly because of my interesting presentation, we've gone up to 1,068 attendees. I thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand back to Anil.
Thank you, Sebastian, for setting the stage of today's webinar. You rightly pointed out that the environmental dimensions, in fact, alter the face of emergencies and the final consequences that that create additional risk for the future humanitarian
Can you hear Anil? Are you able to hear Anil? I'm not hearing him anymore.
No, I can't hear him. I think it's his audio.
On this,
He just logged out.
he just logged out. If I go, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Good afternoon, good morning, folks from around the world. I am extremely delighted to join more than 1,000 participants from over 100 countries who have joined us for this event today. This is completely unusual, extraordinary, but a situation which has happened only because of COVID. The event which you are now going through, Environmental Emergencies webinar, is part of an original 1-week training on environmental emergencies, which the joint unit of UNEP and OCHA has delivered in multiple countries in the last 10 years. But typically only 20 to 30 people get the benefit of that training at any given time. Now, because of COVID, we are in this online world and we are able to share it with 50 times that number of people, which is an extremely good thing. And the fact that there are more than 2,500 people who have expressed experience and more than close to 1,100 who has already joined makes me extremely happy. Welcome back, Anil. Thank you for the opening remarks, and also thank you, Sebastian. We are extremely honored from the United Nations Environment Fund to be a partner to you as well as to the National Institute of Disaster Management to be part of organizing this webinar series. As I mentioned, we have more than 2,500 people who have expressed an interest, and close to 1,100 who have joined. My first proposal to you who are joining from around the world is to stick with this journey. We are planning to form a community of practice of people so that this is not a one-off event and not even a 6-month event. Environmental emergencies are here to stay, unfortunately. In the past, when people spoke about environmental emergencies, we generally thought about oil spills or an event like Bhopal, where clearly the focus of the event was an environmental pollution. But that is no longer the case now. Almost any global crisis have an environmental footprint. We can naturally take COVID-19, for example, clearly a health pandemic, but it is going to have environmental footprint, is already having environmental footprint. My colleague Lisa will speak a bit about that. But let's take conflicts, for example. In fact, the United Nations Environment Program first got into this domain of environmental emergencies after the first Gulf War, that's the conflict in Kuwait in 1991. Clearly, it was a political conflict, a military crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and it was not expected that it will be an environmental crisis as well. But some of you who are old enough would remember that that crisis led to the biggest oil spill in history until that time, when oil went into the Gulf. It led to more than 700 oil wells on fire in Kuwait. Major environmental emergencies. The gas plume reaching all the neighboring countries. So something like a conflict ended up being an environmental emergency as well. But that's not the only situation. We were in Iraq after 2003, where massive pollution was caused by military action in industrial sites. So that's another environmental emergency in a conflict. We were in Ivory Coast in 2013, where 10 years of civil war caused tremendous amount of resource depletion, including deforestation, because there was not adequate control and governance over those resources. We were in DR Congo after the conflict there, where the act of conflict ongoing caused shortage of food and resources, and therefore people ended up poaching wildlife just for their sustenance. So things which you normally don't expect to be an environmental emergency would lead into an environmental emergency. So what you are going to learn in the coming 6 lessons is not about an oil spill or waste management related to a crisis, but an entire range of issues, starting from conflict to disasters. I also want to say that something which you will not assume would cause environmental emergencies, such as a financial crisis, could also lead to environmental emergencies. Number of examples. 2008 crisis. Countries face challenges, financial challenges. And one of the first casualty is lack of resource availability in certain sectors, and environment is always a casualty in such situations. So not only conflict, not only disasters, not only pandemic, you have environmental emergencies coming out of any of the global crises. This is what you will learn from this course. In the United Nations Environment Program, we do a range of work on environmental emergencies. We do post-conflict assessments. We do post-conflict or post-crisis environmental needs assessments, such as what we did in Kerala after the flood in 2018, and many other countries. We do capacity building in countries after major environmental emergencies, such as what we are doing in Afghanistan, we are doing in Haiti, Sudan, South Sudan. We get engaged in countries like Nigeria, where decades of oil pollution has led massive environmental contamination, and the livelihood of the community is affected in a significant manner. And we try to work with the government in those countries to improve the environment, which change their livelihood and improve the life of people. So in this period of time, in the next 6 months, you will be hearing a lot of examples, both from the experience of United Nations Environment Program, but also a number of our partners, about environmental emergencies in range of topics. We encourage you to come to us with questions. I was looking at the question chat box. A number of questions have already come up, and a lot more would come. We would take as many questions as possible today. We have earmarked half an hour for that. But we will also be following up on those questions. We will answer each of your questions. We'll get back to you in due course. But we'll also create a forum where you can answer your own questions. Some of you who are sitting on the other side, I see Leif Johnson from MSBs on listening to this. You know, he has a lot more experience than what, say, I have. So there are a lot of very experienced people out there. So we will create a forum after this webinar, between webinar, where you can all come together and start to engage yourself. We will share documents, we will share guidelines, we will share good practices. for this COVID itself, we are already working in close to 20 countries on waste management, on crisis-linked needs assessment, on socioeconomic assessment. So there's a lot of material to go by. I encourage all of you to stay with us for the 6-month journey and learn as much as possible, but also enrich each other. Thank you for joining, and back to you, Anil.
Thank you, Dr. Muralee, for emphasizing on the importance and also introducing the journey of the 6 months from beginning from today, where we'll be sharing a lot of examples. You rightly pointed out the changing face of environmental emergencies also, as we have been discussing about the changing face of disasters. So it's a two-way kind of a transformation, and that is also being integrated into our knowledge building process for managing crisis across the globe. As in India also, we witnessed the past year, we witnessed air pollution level, so that we had to declare health emergency. So that is also a dimension. We also have been facing during the recent years the devastating forest fires. Similarly, as we had faced the recent bushfire in Australia. So that is also the another kind of form. Then heat-related issues also have been very significant experiences in this part of the world. So certainly the environmental emergencies are now increasingly being recognized as disasters, and this pandemic, which has also witnessed that many of the countries of the world, the disaster management system has been put into operation, and managing the entire affairs of this pandemic management, because of the humanitarian dimensions associated with this, because of the size of major disaster that has been presented by this environmental emergency or the health emergency, whatever we say. Now, moving to the learned speakers of today's webinar, because we have to listen to their the real ground experiences also. I will go to Margarita. Margarita is the focal point for response with the United Nations Environment Program, UN-OCHA Joint Environment Unit, and that has been one of the very significant strategic initiative where the two global organizations joined their hands in highlighting the issues of environmental aspects of disaster response. So over to Margarita for her presentation and discussion.
Thank you very much, Anil, and a very good day, everyone. I hope you're all coping well despite the circumstances. It's a pleasure to see so many of you joining us for this global webinar series. This, as mentioned, is a new initiative that we are launching to continue raising awareness and facilitating knowledge exchange under the current pandemic environment. It offers us a unique opportunity to really engage with a very large audience at once. I see we have governments, regional organizations, NGOs, the private sector, academia, UN colleagues, and many more. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Over the next 6 months, we're going to bring you on a world tour. You will travel the globe without having to leave your home. We'll bring you everywhere, from Asia Pacific to the Americas, via Africa and Europe. There's no need to fasten your seatbelt, no need to wear your masks. Just bring yourself and we will take care of everything else. As Anil already mentioned, we have a very rich program in store for you, and you see it once more on the screen. So stay tuned for all of this. We really appreciate your feedback. So you will receive an email after each webinar that will ask you to complete an evaluation survey, upon which you will also receive the recording of the webinar, as well as the presentations and all materials that are used during the webinar, and a certificate of attendance for the individual webinar. For our top funds, so those who will participate in at least 4 webinars out of 6, we will go even further and we'll provide you with a certificate for the whole series as well. Now, when you register for this webinar, you already signed up for the whole series, so you will receive a reminder prior to each of the following webinars with the connection details, and there's no need to re-register. However, if your colleagues, your friends, or anyone else that maybe could not join us today but is interested in participating in the following webinars, it's still possible to register anytime using the same link that you used for this webinar. So why are we doing this? Why this series and why environment and emergencies? Well, we've heard of many examples from the previous speakers, and there are many more, too many, unfortunately. So Cyclone Idai in Mozambique was one of them. The FSO Safer oil tanker in Yemen was another one. And whether it's natural or human-induced hazards, whether it's disasters or complex emergencies, we see that these are all intrinsically linked with the environment. I'm from the UNEP-OCHA Joint Environment Unit, which is a partnership between the two agencies, and that really brings together the technical expertise of UNEP on the one side and the humanitarian mandate of OCHA on the other side. And as mentioned, it's 26 years old, so it was founded in 1994, and it really embodies the humanitarian development nexus. The mandate of the unit is to support countries in preparing for and responding to the environmental dimensions of disasters and complex emergencies. And whenever there is an emergency, we can dispatch experts and equipment at the request of affected member states. We can perform rapid environmental assessments. We can provide remote support to really make sure that environmental considerations are integrated at the earliest stages of response, before it's just too late to avoid any additional negative impacts, both in terms of human losses, but also of environmental damage. Now, the aim of all of this is really to save lives, livelihoods, and the environment on which we all depend. We've had 218 missions since 1994 of any sort, from response to preparedness and capacity building. The large majority of them, 75%, and the core mandate of the unit remains on response. You see on the screen some of the latest deployments that we've had prior to COVID. And these include, for instance, the dispatch of flood risk managers to Mozambique, as Sebastian mentioned, after Cyclone Idai and Kenneth, and also response to the oil spill, huge quantities of disaster waste and other environmental risks posed by Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. We also have 3 environmental field advisors that are supporting in Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela as a partnership between UNEP and UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, to address the environmental dimensions of the Venezuelan refugee and migrant crisis. Now, these are just a few examples of the many emergencies that we've been called to respond to. And it's not just deployments. We provide remote support as well, which is particularly relevant when there are access constraints, and this is best expressed now under COVID. We've always been providing remote assistance in addition to deployments, but we have looked at strengthening this type of support since 2018, when we actually established a dedicated mechanism, the Remote Environmental Assessment and Analysis Cell, which has since been activated on numerous occasions, as you see on this slide. It has been especially effective in the face of COVID, with a huge thanks to all partners involved, as we would not be able to do this alone. Both for deployments and for remote support, we basically operate through a network of networks. And we can count on a large pool of partners. So I see that many of them are actually with us today, but I also see many new friends, and I hope you will join our community of practice. So generally speaking, I would say that the model that really works best for us to be able to meet all requests for assistance anytime, anywhere, is really to have as many friends as humanly possible, but it's also okay to have some best friends who will always be there when the others may not be available. Over the years, we have responded to all sorts of emergencies, supplying all types of technical expertise. So if you look at the pie chart on the left, you see that about 44% of all experts that we dispatch were generalists that were called to perform some rapid environmental assessments. In addition to these, we have about 10–11% of people that were called to support on coordination, and the remaining were specialists in fields that range from, you see it on the screen, hydrocarbon and chemical contamination, to sampling and analysis, to soil and water contamination, to dam stability, wildfires, waste management, you name it. So we've been called to support countries in all regions, especially in Asia with 27% of missions, Africa with 26%, and the Americas with 21%, as you can see from the other pie chart. If we look at trends in requests for international assistance that we have received since establishment of the unit in 1994, we see an overall increasing trend. However, when we look at most recent years, we see that the trend is actually declining. So we are receiving fewer requests for international assistance nowadays, but deployments tend to be longer. They now average about 3 weeks, and there tends to be more waves of deployments in rotations to match these longer durations. Overall, we're faced on the one end with a changing humanitarian landscape, where we're witnessing strengthened local, national, and regional capacities, and also increased ownership in some parts of the world. And this can explain the declining trend in requests for international assistance, and it also calls for a more localized and decentralized approach to response that can really augment these capacities. At the same time, the COVID crisis is also pushing us to rethink our delivery models, to essentially rethink everything that we have ever known and to look at enhanced remote support. On the other hand, however, we are also faced with the climate crisis, with increased temperatures, with more extreme events happening more frequently, that are increasing humanitarian needs in some of the areas of the world that are already most stressed. So we see this balance. And all in all, we are confronted with unprecedented challenges that really will require transformational change to make sure that we remain fit for purpose in this rapidly changing world. We need to prepare. There is just no option for inaction. We have long been playing with fire, we have been flirting with disaster, and now COVID-19 has brought us all, the entire world, on a speed date with the future. At the Joint Environment Unit, we use our convening power to connect the environmental and humanitarian communities, to foster knowledge exchange, and to develop tools and guidance. And I would like to invite you to check our website, the Environmental Emergency Center that you see on the left, where we have created a page for COVID-19 to compile all dedicated resources as they relate to the environment, as well as EA Connect on the right, for an online repository of guidance on how to integrate environment across humanitarian sectors and clusters. On this website, you will find a collection of our flagship tools that you also see on the slide, and we will discover some of them throughout this webinar series. So stay tuned for all of this. We've also developed a solid training program, which comprises both e-learning opportunities, but also field exercises. And on the very same website that I was mentioning before, the Environmental Emergencies Center, you will find these 5 e-learning modules that are free for everyone to take if you wish to learn more and to deepen your knowledge on the interface between environment and emergencies. We otherwise also have an in-person training program, and we run our flagship Environment and Emergencies training, which is really the one and only UN training on environment and emergencies. It's designed for deployable experts, so it's really to strengthen the skills that are required to operate in emergency situations. And therefore, a key element of it is the simulation exercise. However, of course, in-person training courses have been suspended until further notice under COVID, but this webinar series as a whole draws its structure and content from the Environment and Emergencies training. And while it cannot replace field exercises, it gives us the possibility to reach a much wider audience, as Muralee was mentioning, and we will build on all the experience that we have developed through our training programs for this webinar series. So to conclude, in the face of the climate crisis and of a changing humanitarian landscape, we really need to make sure that we anchor environmental and climate considerations to humanitarian action, and that we do that as a matter of urgency. This is true for disasters, but it's also true for complex emergencies. We must learn from COVID, and we must make sure that we move forward on a greener and more sustainable pathway for our future. This is all from my side. I will be more than happy to take any questions, so please feel free to leave them in the question box. And in the meantime, thank you very much, and back to you, Anil.
Thank you, Margarita, for giving the details and also presenting the opportunities for interns learning, and also the opportunity of working together on a common but important issue of environmental emergencies in the changing scenario in the COVID, during COVID, and also in the post-COVID era. Now, in fact, we have started defining like COVID and post-COVID era of disaster management. Now, moving to the next speaker, Ms. Lisa. Lisa also holds a doctorate degree. So Dr. Lisa is the regional coordinator of disasters and conflict risk management in the UNEP regional office for Asia and Pacific. So over to Lisa for her presentation and discussion on the issue of environmental emergencies. Lisa, please.
Thank you very much, Anil. Just let me set myself up here, and I'm going to assume that everyone can see my slides and hear me unless I get some kind of signal. Hi, my name is Lisa, and today I'm going to be talking about the linkages between environments, emergencies, and the current pandemic. I'm going to focus on 4 points, most of which have already been touched on by previous speakers, but I'll particularly talk about the first 2. So first, Anil introduced we're experiencing compound, cascading, complex crises, many different names for them, but I'm going to focus on the word compound crisis, which means a crisis that has several causes that are all happening at the same time and affecting each other. And existing national and local preparedness and contingency planning under these compound conditions are now likely to be inadequate. And therefore, environmentally sound response could be limited or lacking in some contexts. Second, the international and national movement of experts, technology, equipment, and so on, when there is lockdown in the country, has been seriously constrained. And with rising costs, this means that also humanitarian conditions and capacities can be limited, which also means that the environmentally sound part of humanitarian response, which, as previous speakers have said, sometimes comes last, can also then be limited. Next, health, humanitarian and economic development roles and responsibilities now overlap even more. We've heard about the nexus in the past, and now we're meant to be living it. So prioritization of environmental dimensions is difficult politically. It's difficult when we're asking for funding, because there's this increase in need, but also increase in partners and actors and priorities. And finally, at a national level, in states of emergency or in times of crisis, laws, roles and responsibilities, social norms can all change. And leaders and populations may not be aware of the risks of discarding international and national environmental obligations and commitments. Even in emergencies, even in compound crises, we need to maintain our obligations because we've agreed to them for good reasons. The first point about compound crises, I'm going to touch on the Horn of Africa locust plague. So here I've listed some compound conditions. As you can see, kind of stacked on top of each other, we have a locust infestation. FAO estimates that since the beginning of the outbreak, over 400 billion locusts have been killed across the region through what are obviously essential pesticide spraying programs. There has been several causes of this locust outbreak, which include heavy rainfall, but also in October and December, the season coming up, we have a prediction of below average rainfall, which may impact on food security. We have insecurity in some of the affected countries. And of course, we have COVID-19 impacts and lockdown conditions on top of this. So I'm just going to touch on or highlight some of the environmental dimensions of this emergency. First of all, in green is a root cause at the bottom. More frequent Indian Ocean cyclones in 2018 and 2019 and high rainfall late last year played a key role in this locust plague. Now, experts are telling us that we can't say climate change will equal more locusts, but there is a lot of cause for concern. If we have hotter and wetter conditions in many countries, there may be more plagues. It's very difficult to tell or to model at this stage, but we have to take the precautionary approach, and so risks are increasing. Next, when we talk about locus response, because as we've heard by previous speakers, it's not just root causes of crises that can be environmental, but the humanitarian response may sometimes lead to environmental concerns and challenges. So pesticide is the main tool in this locus response at this stage, but pesticide management systems are not all in place in all countries. There has to be storage, monitoring, cleanup systems, which are now often strained because of the scope of the crisis, and the impact of current spraying on key species, including pollinators such as bees and even animals such as earthworms, is not quantified. We don't know what's going to happen, and that has to mean that there are more risks. Another cause. When we talk about COVID-19, emerging research does indicate that when biodiversity is high, infection rates can be lower. So this crossover between animals, which is wild animals and domestic animals, and humans around zoonotic diseases really means that we have to look at nature as a root cause of this pandemic and of potentially future pandemics. And we need to manage our livestock. We need to manage wildlife. We need to manage habitats. And also things like animal markets and illegal wildlife trade need to be managed and limited better, I suppose. And finally, COVID-19 measures have slowed the importation of appropriate pesticides in some countries for this locust plague and restricted the training and movement of ground control personnel. It's difficult to say what environmental impacts this has, but obviously it has a humanitarian impact, and this can lead on to environmental dimensions that we're not currently considering very well. The next example I'm going to give is around waste management, and this is a picture of medical waste management at the height of the pandemic in China. A major disaster can lead to vast amounts of waste. For example, the 2011 tsunami in Japan created 30 million tonnes of debris, which equals nearly 5 Great Pyramids. Disaster waste includes household waste, healthcare waste, debris from damaged and destroyed buildings, agricultural areas, industrial sites. Depending on the disaster, it can all be mixed together in the environment. And that's particularly concerning at the moment. I've listed on this slide household waste management, medical waste management, and disaster waste management, which have all been already impacted by the pandemic or the lockdown, depending on the country. And if you've seen our waste webinars, you will know this slide. My point here is that there is increasing stress on the whole waste management system at the moment, and current contingency planning and waste management plans are likely to be currently inadequate. Okay, sorry, I thought someone was saying something then. So let me give you a few more highlights. Again, not so much data, so just highlights for the moment. Recycling initiatives in many countries have been shut down and have been slow to restart, particularly if they're part of the informal sector or small businesses. Disaster waste might now include more infectious and hazardous waste. Because we're getting this mix-up of medical waste, household waste in disasters, we need to not just fly in and clean up after disasters anymore. We need to consider that all debris may be potentially hazardous, and this means more training, more equipment, and more time and money, which we don't have usually in disasters. There are risks of trafficking, dumping, and all sorts of illegal activity going on now in waste. And I think that that is clear under the pandemic conditions, but also may be increased if a disaster hits. For example, there were some reports, some media reports, that at least 11 private and government health facilities from only one state in India, Tamil Nadu, were fined in June for dumping untreated medical waste into sewers. The problem is with that is that many sewer lines crisscross drinking water pipes. So if there's any leaks in the sewer pipe, this means that infectious waste could get into drinking water. And this is currently previously been investigated in Delhi and seem to be a real problem. So I'm not saying that Delhi or India has poor standards and poor guidelines and poor laws, because they're very strong there. But when a disaster strikes on top of a pandemic and health systems are overwhelmed and stressed, these things will happen more and more, and we need to be more vigilant. Scaling up waste management under lockdown is certainly going to be more difficult. Although there were very few COVID-19 cases in the Pacific in general, after Tropical Cyclone Harold hit, they couldn't bring in technologies, equipment or personnel for waste management because of lockdown. Emergency waste technology is often less environmentally sound than our day-to-day technologies. And I won't go into that in detail, but you can look at our waste management webinars for more details on technological solutions. And finally, local solutions like cash for work schemes that often employ disaster-affected people after a disaster to clear up the debris and the waste may be less safe now. So we're talking about localizing disaster response, but unless we train local people, provide them with PPE and better equipment, then it may not be safe for them to do so in this waste context. My second point was around constrained movement and rising costs, and I'm going to note an example from Afghanistan. So the health system in Afghanistan is currently overwhelmed, but the COVID-19 peak there has not been reached yet. Crossings between Afghanistan and other countries like Iran and Pakistan have been impacted by closures, and these closures, of course, are aiming at containing COVID-19. However, they do have impacts, for example, on market prices of staple goods. And some closures are straining humanitarian food supply chains, which, combined with logistical bottlenecks in ports in Pakistan, for example, really mean that there are shortages of key humanitarian foods in particular, such that food distributions regularly now have a lower diversity of items available, and a lack of dietary diversity can, in the long term, negatively impact health. Now, humanitarians have requested fast-track procedures for humanitarian goods, but this remains in discussion. And the other limitation is, of course, that with COVID-19 related lockdowns, restrictions have forced some staff members to work remotely, either from Kabul or their location, or from other countries. And this obviously makes some humanitarian response difficult. For example, coordination and monitoring can be more difficult. My third point was around maintaining environmental priorities. We've said a few times that environment is becoming, of course, more commonly recognised in humanitarian response and by humanitarians. And there are many, many guidelines and standards and innovations that are occurring now. And this is reflected by key groups like Sphere. And this text is from a Sphere thematic sheet about doing no harm to the environment and therefore to people. However, it's not always the case that environmental dimensions are taken into account despite all of our progress. For example, the Global Humanitarian Response Plan for COVID-19 was mentioned earlier. And if you look through it, it is unfortunately sometimes difficult to see the details of a strong, sustainable approach that will ensure humanitarians do no harm in this environmental context in this plan. It will, of course, be followed up by recovery and building back better plans, but I think it is important to note here. And my final point, I'm not going to talk about much. I'm just going to scroll through a few headings that I've found recently. From all parts of the world, environmental laws and standards have been dropped or neglected, formally or informally, in the pandemic. And this is not only bad news for our planet, but it could lead to more and worse disaster and climate risks in the future. So finally, the 4 points again. Preparedness and contingency planning is likely to be now inadequate from international, national to local levels because of this compound and cascading crisis condition that we're in. Movements of experts, technology, equipment, relief items, and so on, and rising costs are limiting our capacity to respond in an environmentally sound way. Maintaining the priority of environmental dimensions is difficult, both in terms of funding and politically, and that's understandable on one hand because we do need to save lives first, and there is a huge amount of need. But if we can change our approach or add environmental thinking when we're rolling out humanitarian plans, that would be beneficial in almost all cases. And finally, roles, responsibilities, social norms have changed. But we must remain committed to environmental and climate agreements, responsibilities and laws as far as we are able under the humanitarian imperative to ensure that we're not making future risk. There are some sources that I've cited, and here is my email address if you want to get in touch at any time later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for this very clear and interesting session. Anil, if you are able to hear and manage, you can contact. Otherwise,
Yes, Muralee. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm facing some technical difficulty in between, so it got hang. Anyway, thank you for Lisa. You very nicely provided a, I would say that kind of a technical narration about the entire story of environmental emergency, and also coming up with the concurrent issues. And now it is really interesting to see the question box flooded with the responses, and that that shows that around 1100 plus participants are here. With my colleagues on this panel, we have chosen some questions on round 1, and so we'll try to have at least 2 rounds, and if time permits, we can have a few more questions. So a question that seems very pertinent is about the education system, that the professional education and the university education system. Mr. Ashish Kumar Panda has asked for this question, and I would like to respond to forward it to Muralee to respond. That since environmental emergencies have emerged, especially over this decade, as a kind of a very serious challenge, how do you see the requirement and the strategy of integrating this issue into the curriculum of various disciplines? So over to Muralee to respond to this question.
Yeah, thank you, Anil, and thank you once again, the panelists. To the answer of Mr. Panda's question, I entirely agree with him, actually, that environmental emergencies have now become so commonplace. And also, as I mentioned, it's not only environmental emergencies, almost any emergency, be it cyclone, be it drought, be it earthquake, tsunami, they're all having an environmental footprint, that there should be a lot more people who are knowledgeable about the issue than just experts. You know, we have now 1,100 people learning it today, but that's really not enough. Probably we need 1 million people who know about it. And the best way to impart that knowledge is to embed our learning into the curriculum of various universities around the world. We luckily have some experience of doing it. A similar course which we have held on disaster risk reduction, that's exactly the route we took. So we initially developed the training as a classroom session. Then we went online, similar to what we are now doing. Then we eventually created an academic module which universities can fit into their program. and be it a program on Masters on Water Resource Management, or Bachelors of Civil Engineering, or Agricultural Science, they can adapt this curriculum to whatever is their overall program, and then run the program in their country. And what we did was to train hundreds of college professors to teach that course, and then adapt and use in their own universities. And now it is happening. And this is exactly what should be happening to this course. And I would work with my colleagues in the joint unit and maybe Anil as well, so that we can try to introduce a similar course in the university curriculum around the world. Even if we manage to get into 1,000 universities out of the 10,000 universities which exist, and if they stay for another 10 years in those curriculum, you can imagine the number of people we will be reaching. And truly, Panda, great idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Muralee, for responding to this question. Just to add that in India also we have initiated a university and institutes network on disaster management. So probably there is an opportunity to look into that convergence also. And as we have been discussing, Muralee, you recall our past meetings also. And in fact, this program now which we are delivering in the form of series of webinars was also in fact in principle planned to integrate the university professors also. So certainly that is emerging as a very good opportunity. Now the next question is from Mr. Lakshmi Narayana, who has pointed out that yes, healthy environment protects and safeguards against the crisis and the emergencies. This is recognized, but then despite of this understanding, why the environmental issues are becoming more and more alarming. So would you like to respond, Muralee, or would you like to pass on the question to some of the colleagues?
Maybe. Lisa, do you want to take that?
Well,
Lisa.
That is certainly a very big question. Why are almost all of our environmental indicators globally going down? And this is something that, as a staff member of UNEP, we certainly discuss a lot. And I think it is part of the human psyche, perhaps, that we take for granted our environment, we take for granted our natural resources. And we seem to be going on okay with a degrading environment until we don't, and then it's too late. I think that there is a lot of awareness around how we need to manage our planetary boundaries, our environment, our biodiversity, our ecosystems better. And they are encapsulated in multinational environmental agreements, including the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. But now, are we implementing them? And this is really, I suppose, a test at the moment, because the answer is probably no. But if we can't implement them day to day and we can't commit to them during an emergency, then I think we are in real trouble. So I don't have an answer of how we can improve our environmental indicators globally, but I can say that we have the tools to do so, and all we need to do really is to commit to them.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for answering this question. Now the next question is from Mr. Satya Kumar Rajat. With very interesting questions that comes to us. That is also relating the COVID pandemic experience. That what are the new lessons and what are the kind of issues emerging for integrating into the environmental legislations looking to this COVID-19 pandemic. Who would like to respond to this? Margareta, would you like to respond to this? Or
yeah,
Margareta?
Thank you, Anil. Well, I'll start with some general considerations. I think we will have a lot to harvest after this pandemic in terms of lessons learned, and we will need to dedicate some time across, the development and humanitarian sectors to actually investigate all of those. And right now, I mean, we see some trends, but they also vary across the globe, and many of them will actually be short-lived if we don't, invest into making sure that we harvest any environmental gains and, continue moving towards a greener recovery pathway. So I think right now we are not seeing any clear trends that we can clearly say, we continue throughout the future, and so we definitely identified gaps that will need to be addressed in legislation. Lisa mentioned a lot about waste management, for example, and so really stepping up efforts at the national level also to be able to be prepared for this kind of events that we anticipate will happen again if we really don't, move transition into a more sustainable future. I don't know if the other speakers maybe want to complement.
Yeah, so would anyone else like to add something?
Yes,
Muralee?
Anil, if I could add, thank you. As my colleague Margaret has said, it is too early to make one single proposition, but there are a few things emerging for sure. Number one, it is clear that this disease jumped over from animals to humans. So how do we prevent similar situation from happening, or at least minimize that type of contacts, thereby reduce the chance of other viruses jumping from animals, wildlife to human? Clearly, that's an area which would get a lot of attention, and clearly there will be legislation and possibly even international conventions on that coming up. Number two, the whole issue of waste management. It has always been there. There are enough national legislation on this topic. But when something on the scale of COVID comes in, naturally, it would need a lot more advanced response to that. And even advanced countries were not fully prepared to deal with it. So there is, on one side, there is an infrastructural shortage. There is not enough capacity. On the other side, there is shortage of know-how. How exactly would you deal with this when a country did not have any facility for managing healthcare waste? So in that area, clearly one can expect to have change. The third point where we should focus is a point which Lisa mentioned, where you have change in priorities. And environment was slowly getting to the top of the agenda: livelihood, environment, health. But now suddenly, environment is no longer the priority. The priority has clearly gone to health, which is fine. Priority will now go to livelihood, which is completely understandable. But if in this process we undermine the environmental sustainability, then you get back to the cycle again, that you have health issues, then you have livelihood issues. So we must ensure that the environmental standards are not diluted. So it's not about creating new legislation, but to prevent the existing legislations from being diluted. And that could happen in many countries. Back to you, Anil.
Yeah, thank you, Muralee and Lisa, Margareta, for responding to this question. In fact, that appears to be a very good case for life cycle assessment, life cycle environmental impact assessment for the COVID, as the pre-COVID, during COVID, and even the side effects of COVID, like the waste generation and all kind of things, and then impact on livelihood. So that can really. And then coming to the next question, that is also an interesting one. That is the question is by Ms. Anushri. Anushri is asking that we have during our discussions referred to the environmental issues arising of the political crisis and the war situations kind of things. So how the environmental emergencies or the environmental consequences of the conflicts and the war kind of situations are serious, and particularly to different parts of the world in changing developmental scenario. So I think yeah, Muralee, you would like to take this question.
Thank you. Anil, I would do my take, and then actually both Lisa and Margaret also may have something to add. The direct link impacts of environment of conflict on environment is very well known. What is not very obvious is that whether there is an environmental footprint on the conflict itself. Are there conflicts happening because there is an environmental root to that? There are many people who believe that if there is a third world war, it would be caused by pressure over resources, such as water. Some people believe that it could be over land, because more people and they would need more space to grow food and so on and so forth. And there are many studies on that. Actually, our own organization have done a number of studies where the resource conflict linkages has been studied. And it comes out with very interesting results that countries which have high value minerals, such as gold, such as diamonds, such as oil, instead of them naturally getting prosperous because of those minerals, they have more possibility that they end up into conflicts. When we analyzed a number of conflicts, we found that even if the minerals, high value minerals, did not by itself lead to the conflict, it either prolonged the conflict or aggravated the conflict, because the parties had access to a lot of money. And this is number of resource conflicts around the world. We know that when low value natural resources, such as timber, is involved, capturing territory is not just about politics, it's also having access to those resources, which could then be used to gain more money, to buy more weapons, and then lead into conflict. So there are multiple ways in which natural resources and conflicts are interlinked, and there are multiple experiences. After this session, we will actually share with you few of our publications on this matter. Actually, we have a series of 6 edited books linking resources and conflict, and we will share linkages of that with the participants. I will share, ask if others wanted to add a point or two. Over.
Thank you, Muralee. So, Margarita, would you like to add to this issue?
Maybe just to add a bit on the response side. So then obviously it becomes really important when we provide humanitarian assistance to conflict affected countries to really be aware and make sure of all these issues, because they play a very important role in that. And in terms of the support that the UNEP-OCHA Joint Environment Unit can offer and UNEP as a whole can offer is really also to support humanitarian actors on that. Unfortunately, when it comes to humanitarian programming, environment is a cross-cutting issue. So as such, it's often forgotten. So that's our role, and the UNEP role as a whole to advocate for that as well. And we definitely see the relevance and the links for that.
Thank you, Margarita. Lisa, you would like to add to this point?
Yeah, perhaps I'm not directly speaking to the question, but I just want to support Muralee and Margarita by saying that I'm sitting in Bangkok in Asia, and it's not a part of the world where we think about big conflict, strong conflict. But when we look at the idea that our environment is changing faster than it ever has before in human history, when we're talking about the fact that we don't know really what's going to happen with our climate, when we have reports from the World Bank that say that it's possible that 40 million people will be internally displaced because of climate in South Asia in the very near future, and millions of people will now be underwater, including my home city of Bangkok here, then the risks of conflict, I think, are going to take some people by surprise. I think issues that have previously been solved peacefully will now become exacerbated. And I really hope that we're not talking in 10 years' time about increased conflict in many regions where we didn't previously expect it, but I suspect we will.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. In fact, this is a very interesting point because the conflicts, as Muralee also pointed out, that there is the other way impact of environmental crisis that can lead to conflicts, and sometimes even the conflicts between the entrepreneurs and the communities over the limited natural resources. For example, when there are water drinking industries kind of thing. So that has also been the question. So certainly the natural resource management and dealing with environmental emergencies becomes an important dimension, and that is the reason now in the business management domain also the great emphasis is being given on sustainability integration. Now coming to the next question from Mr. Florence. He's asking about his question is again on the COVID-19 crisis and the environmental impacts. He's asking about the evidences that how we are going to collect the proper evidence-based information so that it helps into the planning process, or we can draw pertinent lessons out of it. So should I start with Margareta? Would you like to respond to this question? Should I?
Sorry, can you please pass it on to the other speakers? Thank you.
Yes, possibly I can take it and also reread the question. This question is from Florence, and the question is, what kind of emerging evidence do we have on the environmental impact of the COVID-19 crisis, especially in lower income countries? And then she goes on to suggest that it will be helpful to share a literature review or document collating existing evidence. An excellent question, actually. When the crisis started to evolve, naturally, all of us, Margareta in Geneva, Lisa in Bangkok, our friend Dan in Panama, we were all looking at this type of evidence coming in, both negative as well as positive happening. I had Ms. Devasri, who is actually part of this organizing team, working in Kerala, collating the evidence, exactly as mentioned. Lisa has actually prepared a document creating the conceptual architecture of how environment and COVID is linked. She presented some of it here. She could elaborate as well. What we have done is to collect the anecdotal evidence of the various issues, such as how it impacted waste pickers in South Africa, for example, how it impacted wildlife in Kenya, for example, how it is impacting disposal of liquid waste in Suriname, for example. So there are a number of these impacts which we have compiled over the last 3 months, and we will be very happy to share that. Right now it's in a little bit of a rough form, so to say. It's not, it is compiled, it's not into a document form, but we can share it as whatever condition it is. But it is indeed our intention to formulate this into some sort of a report, go back to Lisa's framework, and then come out with some sort of a conclusion as to what we can do to ensure that these issues are addressed, and in future emergencies, they don't happen or anticipated. Lisa, if you want to add anything, you can add.
No, I wouldn't want to add anything else except to say that many different agencies are bringing out reports, analyses, assessment on different aspects. For example, the International Energy Association, I think, had their Global Energy Review 2020 was revised to a COVID slant, and many of the banks and obviously UN agencies are putting out a lot of information. The problem is putting it into a conceptual framework and really seeing what is relevant and what we can do, I think will be the work of many months.
Yeah, so thank you, panel, for responding to this question jointly, which has been a very important question. I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions and then we can move towards closing as we have a few minutes left with us. So a question that is about making this interaction interactive. The question is asked by Shabendu Pathaka. He's asked, while thanking, he's also asking that and suggesting that how this forum can be made more interactive, where the participants can share their thoughts, ideas, expertise with among themselves and also with the external resource persons. So Muralee, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, there are over 1,000 people still, an hour and a half later, still listening to the event, and maybe a few hundred people who came in and listened for some time and moved out. And clearly, another 1,000 people had expressed interest. So clearly, there's a body of people who have interest in this topic, and many of them may have even experiences to share. So we are looking into what is an appropriate way to deal with it. The webinar, GoToWebinar itself have some sort of a chat option, but probably that's not as user-friendly, and also that would be then an internal forum. One idea could be to create something outside, such as on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. In the domain of disaster risk reduction, this is what was done. The participants came together and formed a page on disaster risk reduction, and suddenly they have 10,000 members, and they start to communicate each other. And we don't moderate it particularly, but we do provide inputs from time to time. That's one possibility. After this event today, I would actually have a discussion with Margarita and Anil to see how exactly we can have a semi-moderated forum. You are all adults, so you don't really need moderation too much. But at the same time, to ensure that some questions which are not answered by anybody else is answered. More and more lecturers are going to come in. They can be included. Many more people would join. So clearly, that is the concept which is in our mind. We have another 3,000 participants from another COVID-linked event which we conducted. So, we have a critical mass to initiate it. So maybe I can ask Margarita if you already have some sort of a forum, because you do have an Environmental Emergencies forum, but does it have a user interaction function so that we could plug into it rather than creating something new? If it's not there, we can create, but I just wanted to check.
I think we're looking at different figures. The magnitude is different compared to the numbers of people we usually deal with. So we'll have to explore, alternative options for this because, it's if we're going to have 1,000 participants for each webinar, and maybe they will not coincide each time. It's definitely way more than the numbers we usually look at, which is very good. It's an opportunity gain in this context that we have access. We can have access to so many people, and really expand our outreach. So we'll definitely look into all options that exist too, because we have our usual community of practices, but we're speaking of different numbers. So we'll look at the best opportunities that we can offer to engage more with the audience. Thank you.
So thank you for answering this question. And now, in fact, we have a great number of questions, in fact, and so I can't say that any question is not useful. All the questions carry very important messages, and even some are so critical. So certainly, as the Muralee mentioned, that we will look at each and every question and we'll try to respond to that through the other follow-up means. And at this the inaugural webinar, we try to sum up in a way that the linkage between environment and emergencies are so inevitable also, but so important also to deal with the broader perspectives of sustainability, because we at the same time we have the path adapted to our journey for achieving sustainable development goal, and at the same time we have to enable climate actions, climate centered actions, and on the other hand we have to try to reduce the morbidity and mortality arising out of the disasters, extreme events and emergencies. So we can summarize this relationship into four pillars between environment and emergencies. The first one is that environment is also an important crisis risk driver. So environmental degradation can exacerbate the situations that can lead to emergencies or the hazards, and environment sometimes can also be the source of hazards. For example, like the locust attack or even this pandemic. So the environmental natural gene stock is also associated, and then mismanagement, or how do we deal with our pristine systems or the resources. So that is also important. The second point is that the emergencies, conflicts and disasters also lead to severe damages to the environment and ecosystems. And the third important aspect is about relief and recovery operations. So environmental concerns are sometimes marginalized or overlooked during emergency response, relief, and also the recovery periods, and that can lead to future risk of disasters and emergencies. And the fourth one, which is the key lesson, that is the integrated environment and emergency management can really help our journey smoothen towards achieving the sustainable development goals, and in other words, the real human development objectives. So with this, I sincerely extend our gratitude to all the speakers, to Sebastian and Muralee for giving opening remarks and taking up a number of questions, Muralee, and to the two speakers, Margareta and Lisa. And not only for today's webinar, for designing the entire series of webinar, and we will be together working for this entire series. And to all the participants, more than 1,000 participants, and in fact many of them must be joining, so numbers are certainly going to increase from the next webinar. So thank you very much all the participants, and we will try to keep in touch. We will try to find out the ways and means to interact more and more, create alternative platforms also, so that we can work together on this journey of integrated environment and emergency management. And the next webinar, which is scheduled on 19th of August. So hope to see you all participating in the second webinar. And I would also like to mention to you that we will be sharing with you a feedback form, because your feedback and suggestions are very valuable for all of us to improve our delivery and the designs of the webinars, and also to enhance the outreach and impact of these initiatives. So you will be receiving over your registered email IDs. Please find out some time to respond to those feedback forms. So with this, thank you very much, and I would request Muralee to say a few words as concluding remarks. Over to Muralee.
Thank you, Anil. I think you have moderated it excellently, and I don't think there is much to add. I can only say how delighted we are to still have 1,000 participants after an hour and a half. Normally, we try to stick it to 1 hour because we know these days there are too many webinars, and all of you are very busy. But still, to have more than 1,000 participants after an hour and a half is quite encouraging. And please stick with us. We have a lot more speakers coming in, a lot more experiences coming in, lot more experts coming in. The forum would be up between now and the next event. So we look forward to seeing you all. And depending upon where you are, have a good evening, good afternoon. And for those of you in the Caribbean and east and west coast of United States who joined probably very early in the morning, we will try to keep your own time in mind when we design other programs, but we might even do special program for your region. But thank you today for joining. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.